The escape pod hit the jungle canopy at 300 kilometers per hour, and Lieutenant Mira Vasquez felt every single branch that tried to slow her down. She screamed as the metal shell around her twisted and groaned and finally slammed into the soft mud of Catherine IV with enough force to rattle her teeth and crack. Something in her left arm that should not have cracked for a long moment. She just lay there in the wreckage and listened to the sounds of the alien jungle outside and tried to remember how to breathe. The Artemis 7 was gone, and she had watched it break apart in the upper atmosphere like a toy being torn by an angry child, and she had been the only one close enough to the emergency pods to make it out alive. Captain Torres had pushed her toward the pod and told her to run, and she had run, and now Captain Torres was dust scattered across the sky of a planet that nobody wanted to visit. Mira forced herself to move, and pain shot through her arm like fire, but she ignored it because pain meant she was alive, and alive was better than the alternative. She kicked open the pod door, and humid air rushed in and filled her lungs with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else underneath it all, and something that smelled like blood and death and things that hunted in the dark. The galactic surveys had marked this world with a red warning that simply said, Apex Predator Saturation, and the words avoid in capital letters that left no room for argument. Mira had read those surveys during her training, and she had thought they were exaggerated because every jungle world had predators, and humans had been dealing with predators since they lived in caves on Earth. She realized now that she had been very stupid. The jungle around her was not quiet, and it was not peaceful, and it was full of sounds that made her spine want to crawl out of her body and find somewhere safer to hide. She pulled herself out of the pod and checked her supplies, and found 3 days of rations and a medical kit and a distress beacon that would take 2 standard weeks to reach anyone who might care enough to come looking. 2 weeks on a death world with a broken arm and 3 days of food, and Mira almost laughed at how badly the universe had decided to treat her today. She set the beacon and watched it blink to life, and then she started walking because staying near the crash site meant staying near the smoke and the smell of burning metal, and those things would attract attention from creatures she did not want to meet. The first day was bad, and the second day was worse. Her arm swelled and turned purple, and she ran out of painkillers by noon on day 2. And the jungle seemed determined to kill her in 100 different ways. There were plants that reached for her with thorns, dripping something that hissed when it touched the ground, and there were insects the size of her fist that watched her with too many eyes, and there were sounds in the undergrowth that followed her and never quite showed themselves. On the second night, something attacked her, and she never saw what it was, but she felt claws rake across her ribs, and she screamed and swung her good arm and hit something that snarled and retreated into the darkness. She ran, and she did not stop running until her legs gave out. The wound on her ribs was deep, and it bled through the bandages. She wrapped around it, and by morning, she could feel her starting to build in her blood like a fire that would not stop growing. She needed shelter, and she needed rest, and she needed a miracle, because without one, she was going to die on this planet, and nobody would ever know what happened to her. The cave appeared on the third day, like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was making. It was set into a hillside, and the entrance was wide and dark, and the rock overhead would protect her from the acid rain that had started to fall and burn tiny holes in her uniform. Myra stumbled toward it, and she did not notice the bones scattered around the entrance, and she did not see the massive claw marks gouged into the stone, and she did not smell the musk of something large and dangerous that had made this place its home. She was too tired and too sick and too desperate to notice anything except the promise of darkness and rest. She collapsed against the cave wall and felt the cool stone against her burning skin, and she closed her eyes and let the fever pull her down into unconsciousness. She did not see the shape stirring in the deeper darkness of the cave. She did not see the 6 pairs of luminous eyes that opened and turned toward her with curiosity and hunger. The Vethrak cubs were young, but they were not helpless, and their claws could already tear through metal, and their jaws could crush bone, and they had been taught since birth that anything that entered their den uninvited was either food or enemy. The largest of them rose from the pile of sleeping siblings and crept toward the strange creature that had fallen near the entrance. It was small and soft, and it smelled like blood and sickness and something else that the cub did not recognize, and something that was not quite prey and not quite predator. The cub circled the creature and sniffed at its wounds and tasted the blood on the air and waited for the instinct to attack to rise up in its chest, like it always did when food presented itself. But the instinct did not come. Instead, there was something else, and something that felt almost like curiosity and almost like recognition and almost like the strange pull that made the cubs press close to their mother when the nights grew cold. The creature shivered and made a small sound of pain, and the cub tilted its head and made a decision that it did not understand. It lay down beside the creature and pressed its scaled body against the soft, trembling form. Warmth for warmth, life for life. One by one, the other cubs woke and watched, and then they too crept forward and joined their sibling until the strange, soft creature was buried beneath a pile of apex predator young outside the cave. The acid rain fell, and the jungle screamed with the voices of 1,000 hungry things. But inside the den, Lieutenant Mira Vasquez slept on, and her fever burned, and her wounds bled, and 6 young predators kept her alive through the night with nothing but instinct and warmth and a choice that none of them could explain. When the morning came, she was still breathing, and that was the first miracle. The Vethrak matriarch was a creature of nightmares and legends, and she had earned both through 11 years of absolute dominance over everything that walked or crawled or flew on. Catherine IV, the xenobiologists who had studied her kind from the safety of orbital stations, called her species impossible, and they used words like apex and ultimate and extinction level when they wrote their reports. They called her Sakith because they needed a name for something that terrified them, and that name meant death that walks in a language from a world that no longer existed. She stood 3 meters tall at the shoulder, and her hide was thick enough to turn aside plasma fire, and her jaws could crush the hull of an escape pod like paper, and her eyes held an intelligence that most scientists refused to believe could exist in something so perfectly designed for killing. She had gone hunting in the deep jungle, and she had brought down a creature twice her size, and she had dragged it back to her den to feed her cubs. She smelled the wrongness before she reached the cave entrance. Something was in her den, and something that did not belong, and something that smelled like blood and sickness, and a strange sharp scent that she had never encountered before. The growl that rose from her chest was low and deep, and it shook loose stones from the cave ceiling and sent small creatures fleeing in terror for 100 meters in every direction. She entered the den with her claws extended and her muscles coiled to strike, and she found her cubs piled around something small and soft and utterly out of place. A human Sakith knew what humans were because she had seen their ships in the sky, and she had found their crashed vessels in the jungle, and she had eaten the bodies of those who had not survived long enough to escape. They were soft and weak, and they died easily, and they were prey in every way that mattered. But this one was still alive. This one was lying in her den surrounded by her cubs, and it was still breathing, and her cubs were not eating it, and that made no sense at all. The growl grew louder, and the human stirred and opened its eyes and looked up at her. Mira woke to the sight of death standing over her, and for a moment her fever-addled brain could not process what she was seeing. The creature was massive and beautiful and terrifying, and it was staring at her with eyes that glowed like molten gold, and it was making a sound that she could feel in her bones. She should have screamed, but she was too weak to scream. She should have run, but running would have been pointless, and some deep part of her understood that running was what prey did, and prey did not survive encounters with things like this. So instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She met the creature's gaze, and she held it. Not with defiance and not with challenge, but with something else entirely. And something that was almost like acceptance, and almost like recognition. She was going to die here, and she knew it, and she was too tired to be afraid anymore. The cubs stirred around her, and the largest one rose to its feet and stood between Mira and its mother, and made a sound that was part bark and part whine and part something that sounded almost like a plea. Saketh's massive head tilted to the side. In 11,000 years of evolution, her kind had never faced a challenge in their own dens, because nothing was stupid enough to challenge. A Vetric and nothing was strong enough to survive if it tried. But this creature was not challenging her, and it was not running, and it was not submitting, and it was just lying there and looking at her and waiting for what the cub made. The sound again, and pressed its body against the human, and Saketh felt something shift in her ancient predator brain. This was not food. This was not enemy. This was something new. She remembered the first time her cubs had brought her a gift, and it had been a small creature they had killed together, and they had laid it at her feet with pride, and she had eaten it to show them they had done well. Perhaps this was the same thing but different. Perhaps her cubs had found something, and they had claimed it, and they were showing her what they had done. Saketh dropped her kill at the human's feet, and the carcass landed with a wet thump that made Myra flinch. The message was clear, even through the fog of fever and pain. Eat, prove you are worth keeping, prove you are pack. Myra's hands shook as she reached for the raw meat, and her stomach turned at the thought of what she was about to do. But she understood that this was a test, and failing meant dying, and she was not ready to die yet. She tore off a piece of flesh with her fingers and brought it to her mouth and chewed and swallowed and forced herself not to gag. The matriarch watched her with those glowing golden eyes, and the cubs watched too, and the cave was silent, except for the sound of Myra eating and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. When she finished, she looked up at the massive predator and waited for judgment. Saketh made a sound that was low and rumbling, and it was not a growl this time, and it was something else entirely, and something that might have been approval or acceptance or simply acknowledgement that the strange soft creature had passed the first test. She turned away and lay down near the back of the cave and closed her eyes. The cubs relaxed and settled back around Myra, and the largest one licked her face with a tongue like sandpaper, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. She had been accepted. She did not know what that meant yet, and she did not know what would happen next, and she did not know if she would survive long enough to find out. But she was alive, and she was warm, and she was surrounded by creatures that should have killed her but had chosen not to. The compact was made. The pack had grown by one, and somewhere in the fever dreams that pulled her back down into unconsciousness, Myra Vasquez began to understand that surviving on Kethron 4 would require her to become something more than human, something wilder, something stronger, something worthy of the creatures that had decided she belonged to them. The acid rain fell outside, and the jungle screamed, and inside the den a human slept among predators and dreamed of hunting. The fever broke on the 5th day, and Mira woke with a clear head for the first time. Since the crash, she was still weak, and her arms still throbbed with pain, and the wound on her ribs was held together by nothing but dried blood and stubborn hope. But she was alive, and that was more than she had expected. The cubs were gone when she opened her eyes, and for a moment, she felt a strange panic rise in her chest, like she had been abandoned. Then she heard them outside the cave, and she heard the sounds of playing and mock fighting and the happy yips of young predators practicing the skills they would need to survive. She pulled herself to her feet and walked on shaking legs to the cave entrance and stood there in the morning light and watched the creatures that had saved her life. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, and their scales caught the sunlight and shimmered with colors she did not have names for, and their movements were graceful and deadly and perfect. The largest cub spotted her first, and it bounded over to her with enthusiasm that nearly knocked her down, and it pressed its head against her chest and made a sound that was almost like purring. Mira laughed, and the sound surprised her because she had not expected to laugh again. She scratched behind the cub's ears and found a spot that made its whole body go limp with pleasure, and she filed that information away for later, because knowledge was survival, and survival was everything. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life. She set her broken arm with sticks and strips torn from her uniform, and she cleaned her wounds with water from a stream. That did not try to kill her, and she learned to eat the meat that Sakith brought back from her hunts. The first few meals made her sick, but her body adapted, and humans were good at adapting, and soon she could eat raw flesh without flinching. She learned the rhythm of the den, and she learned her place in it, and she learned that the Vethraks were not mindless killing machines, but complex social creatures with rules and hierarchies, and something that looked almost like culture. Sakith was the queen, and her word was law, and she led the hunts and settled disputes and protected the territory from rivals. The cubs were students, and they watched their mother and learned from her, and they practiced their skills on each other and on any unfortunate creature that wandered too close to the den. And Mira was something new, and something that did not fit into any category they had ever known. She was not prey, because prey ran and died, and she had done neither. She was not pack, because pack were Vethrak, and she was clearly not Vethrak. She was not rival, because rivals challenged and fought, and she had no hope of challenging anything larger than the smallest cub. So they treated her as something between all of these things, and they watched her with curiosity, and they tested her with small challenges, and they waited to see what she would become. Mira decided to become useful. She could not hunt like them, and she could not fight like them, and she could not run like them, but she had something they did not have. She had hands that could grip and shape and build. She found a piece of metal from the crash site, and she spent 3 days sharpening it against a stone until it was a blade, and the first time she used it to cut meat for the cubs, they stared at her with something like wonder. She built traps for small game, and she showed the cubs how they worked, and she let them spring them and collect the prey inside, and they brought her gifts in return, and small creatures they had killed, and colorful stones they had found, and once a flower that smelled like honey. She learned their language, and it was not words, but it was growls and postures and set markers and the position of ears and the angle of tails and the 1,000 tiny signals that told pack members what was happening and what was needed. She invented sounds for them, and sounds that meant danger and food and stay and come and hunt, and the cubs learned these sounds and responded to them. And Sakith watched with her ancient golden eyes and said nothing but missed nothing. Other Vethraks came to the den as the weeks passed. They were subordinates in Sakith's territory, and they came to pay tribute and show submission and confirm their place in the hierarchy that she commanded. They stared at Mira with horror and confusion, and something that might have been fear. Here was a soft, weak human sitting among the cubs of the most powerful predator on the planet, and she was not running, and she was not dead, and she was sharpening a blade while the young ones played around. Her feet Sakith permitted this. That meant something. That meant the human was under the matriarch's protection, and harming her would mean challenging Sakith herself, and nobody was stupid enough to do that. By the end of the first month, Myra could move through the hunting grounds without being attacked. The other predators in the territory knew her scent, and they knew she belonged to the den, and they avoided her the same way they avoided the cubs. By the end of the second month, she could signal the pack to coordinate attacks. She would spot prey from her position in the trees, and she would make the sound for hunt and point in the direction, and the cubs would move like shadows through the undergrowth and bring down creatures twice their size. By the end of the third month, she made her first kill alongside them. It was a beast the size of a horse with tusks like spears and hide like armor, and it had wandered into their territory looking for food and found death instead. The cubs drove it toward her, and she stepped out of the shadows with her blade in her hand, and she moved with a speed and viciousness that surprised even her and the blade found the soft spot behind the creature's ear, and it fell. The cubs screamed in celebration, and they howled and yipped and danced around the kill, and Mira stood over the body with blood on her hands and something wild in her eyes. Socketh emerged from the jungle and looked at the human and looked at the kill and made a sound that Mira had never heard before. It was approval. It was pride. It was welcome. The matriarch approached the kill, and she did not eat first like she always did, and instead, she stepped back and lowered her massive head and waited. Mira understood. She was being given the honor of first blood. She was being recognized as a hunter. She cut a piece of meat from the kill and ate it, while the pack watched, and then she stepped back and let them feed, and she stood among them with blood on her lips, and the jungle screaming around her, and she was not afraid. She was home, she was pack, and Catherine IV was no longer trying to kill her because she had become part of its deadly, beautiful, terrible ecosystem. The distress beacon still blinked somewhere in the wreckage of her pod, and help was coming. But Mira was no longer sure she wanted to be rescued. She was becoming something new, and she was not finished yet. The hegemony patrol ship Cruel Mathematics dropped out of hyperspace above Catherine IV on a mission that its commander expected to be simple and profitable. Commander Vethro was a syndicate officer with scales the color of dried blood and eyes that had watched countless slaves broken and sold, and he had built his career on finding valuable things in places where others were afraid to look. A human survivor from a crash on a death world was exactly the kind of valuable thing he specialized in. Finding humans were worth money in the right markets, and a female in good condition could be sold to pleasure houses or labor camps or research facilities that did not ask questions about where their subjects came from. The distress beacon had been broadcasting for 3 months, and Vethro had been the first to intercept it. And he had come quickly and quietly because he did not want to share his prize with anyone. He took a landing party of 12 soldiers, and they dropped through the atmosphere in a combat shuttle, and they landed near the crash site with weapons ready and scanners active. The scanners told him the human was still alive, and that surprised him because nothing survived 3 months on Catherine IV, and the surveys were very clear about that. The scanners also told him she was surrounded by apex predator signatures, and that made no sense at all. Vethrol ordered his soldiers forward, and they moved through the jungle in a tight formation with plasma rifles raised and eyes scanning every shadow. They found the cave within an hour. They found the bones scattered around the entrance and the massive claw marks gouged into the stone, and the smell of something large and dangerous that made several of his soldiers hesitate. Vethrol did not hesitate because hesitation was weakness, and weakness was death, and he had not become a syndicate commander by being weak. He signaled his soldiers to spread out and surround the cave entrance, and he activated his translator and called out in the standard human trade language, "Human female, you are being rescued by the Hegemony Patrol. Come out with your hands visible, and you will not be harmed." The jungle went silent. Even the insects stopped their endless chirping, and the birds stopped their screaming, and there was nothing but the rustle of leaves in the wind and the breathing of 12 nervous soldiers. Vethrol waited, and nothing emerged from the cave, and he was about to order his soldiers to go in when he heard something behind him, a growl low and rumbling and coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mira stepped out of the jungle 30 meters to his left, and Vethrol turned to face her, and what he saw made his scales go pale. She was not the broken, desperate survivor he had expected. She was lean and scarred and muscled in ways that humans were not supposed to be muscled, and she carried a blade that gleamed in the filtered sunlight, and her eyes were wild and cold and utterly without fear. She was also not alone. Shapes moved in the shadows behind her and around her and on all sides, and Vethrol counted 6 sets of glowing eyes before he stopped counting, because there were more and more kept appearing. The cubs had grown in 3 months, and they were half the size of their mother now, and their scales were darker, and their claws were longer, and they looked at the Hegemony soldiers, the way they looked at prey, rescued Mira said, and her voice was rough. From disuse and sharp, with something that might have been anger or might have been amusement. You came here to rescue me, Vethril. Recovered quickly, because he was a professional and professionals did not panic. Yes, he said, and he kept his voice. Steady and reasonable, we received your distress signal, and we came to bring you home. Myra said, and she tilted her head in a way that was not quite human anymore, and not quite Vethrek, but something in between. I am home. The largest of the cubs moved to stand beside her, and it pressed against her leg and made a sound that was almost like a purr, and Mira rested her hand on its head. Without looking away from Vethril, you came here to sell me, she said, and it was not a question. Your ship is hegemony, and the hegemony does not rescue humans, and the hegemony sells them. Vethril's hand moved toward his sidearm, and that was a mistake. The jungle exploded. Socketh came from above, and she dropped from the canopy like a falling mountain. And she landed on 3 soldiers before they could even scream, and her jaws closed on a 4th, and the sound of crunching bone and tearing metal filled the air. The cubs attacked from the sides, and they moved like shadows, and their claws tore through armor like paper, and plasma bolts scorched the trees, but hit nothing because the Vethraks were too fast and too smart, and they had been hunting together for generations. A dozen subordinate Vethraks emerged from the undergrowth, and they were drawn by the sounds of battle and the smell of blood, and they joined the slaughter with enthusiasm. In less than 30 seconds, 12 hegemony soldiers became 12 bodies, and the jungle floor was slick with blood that was not human and not Vethric. Only Vethril survived. He survived because Mira had signaled the pack to leave him alive, and she had made the sound that meant wait, and the cubs had obeyed, and they had pinned him to the ground. Instead of killing him, Socketh stood over him with one massive paw on his chest, and her golden eyes burned with something that was not quite hunger, and was not quite anger, and was something much worse. Mira walked forward and stood over the syndicate commander and looked down at him with no expression on her scarred face. You were going to sell me, she said again. Vethril tried to bargain, and he promised wealth and power and position and everything he could think of that might make this human spare his life. Mira did not respond. Vethril tried to threaten, and he told her that the hegemony would come looking, and they would burn this planet to ash, and they would find her and make her suffer. Myra did not respond. Vethril tried to beg, and he wept and pleaded, and offered to do anything she wanted if she would just let him live. Myra looked at the largest cub, and she made a sound, a specific sound, a word she had invented in those early fevered days when she had nothing but instinct and survival and the warmth of predators keeping her alive. Eat. The cub understood. Vethril screamed, but not for long. Mira watched without flinching, and when it was done, she turned to Socketh, and the matriarch lowered her great head and pressed her forehead against Myra's chest in a gesture of respect and affection. They stood together among the bodies and the blood and the silence. The pack had defended its own. The pack had won. And somewhere above them, the cruel mathematics waited in orbit for a commander who would never return. The rescue ship Horizon's Dawn arrived 3 days after the slaughter, and the crew expected to find wreckage and bones and the sad remains of another human lost to a death world. Captain Elena Reyes had volunteered for this mission because she believed no one should die alone and unmourned in the dark between stars, and she had brought a full survey team and a xenobiologist and a chaplain to say words over whatever they found. What they found was something none of them had ever imagined. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere, and the pilot followed the distress beacon signal, and they landed in a clearing not far from the cave, and Captain Reyes led her team into the jungle with weapons holstered because this was supposed to be a recovery mission and not a combat operation. They found the hegemony body's first 12 soldiers, torn apart by something massive and powerful, and the plasma burns on the trees told the story of a fight that had been brief and one-sided. An utterly devastating Reyes ordered her team to stay alert, and they moved forward with hands on their weapons and hearts pounding in their chests. They found the cave, and they found the bones, and they found the claw marks, and they found something else that made all of them stop and stare. A throne. It was built from pieces of hegemony, hull plating, and it was crude and rough, but it was unmistakably a seat of power, and it sat at the entrance to the cave like a declaration and a warning. And sitting on that throne was Lieutenant Mira Vasquez. She was barely recognizable as the officer whose file Reyes had studied on the flight here, and her hair was long and wild, and her skin was scarred and tanned, and her eyes held something ancient and feral that made Reyes want to look away. She wore scraps of her uniform mixed with pieces of hide and bone, and she held a blade across her lap that was stained with old blood, and her posture was relaxed and confident and utterly without fear. Cubs played at her feet, and they were the size of wolves, and their scales gleamed, and their claws clicked on the stone, and they looked at the rescue team with curiosity, but not hostility. Behind the throne, something massive stirred, and Reyes looked up and up and up at a creature the size of a dropship, and it lay curled around the seat like a guardian and like a warning, and one of its enormous paws rested near Myra's shoulder like an armrest. Saketh opened one golden eye and regarded the newcomers, and then closed it again and went back to sleep. Lieutenant Vasquez Reyes said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "We received your distress signal and we came to bring you home." Myra looked at her for a long moment, and then she smiled, and the smile was not quite human anymore. "Took you long enough," she said. The xenobiologist on the team was a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, and she had spent her entire career studying predator behavior and pack dynamics, and she had never seen anything like what she was seeing now. She watched the cubs interact with Myra, and she watched Saketh permit human presence in her territory, and she watched the way the other Vethrax who lurked at the edges of the clearing deferred to the human on the throne. "This is impossible," she whispered. Mira heard her and laughed, and the sound was rough and wild and beautiful. "Nothing is impossible," she said. "Humans adapt and we survive, and we find ways to belong wherever we end up." Dr. Tanaka would later write a paper that would shake the foundations of galactic xenobiology, and she would argue that humans were not simply adaptable, but integrative, and they did not merely survive hostile environments, but became part of them. They formed bonds where no bonds should be possible, and they earned loyalty from creatures that had never known the concept, and they made themselves necessary in ways that defied every model of predator-prey relations. Myra refused evacuation for 6 more months. She stayed because there was work to do, and the pack needed her, and she needed the pack, and leaving felt like abandoning family. She taught Dr. Tanaka everything she had learned about the Vethrax and their language and their culture and their complex social structures, and she helped establish the first peaceful contact between humans and the apex predators of Catherine 4. When she finally agreed to leave, she did not go alone. 3 of the cubs came with her, and they were grown now, and deadly and utterly devoted, and they refused to let her go without them, and Saketh did not stop them because pack was pack, and the bond they had formed could not be broken by something as simple as distance. The matriarch watched the shuttle rise from the jungle canopy, and she did not grieve because Vethrax did not grieve, but she remembered. She remembered the soft, broken creature that had stumbled into her den, and she remembered her cubs choosing to keep it warm, and she remembered the moment when that creature had looked her in the eye and refused to run. She remembered the hunts they had shared and the kills they had made and the blood they had spilled together defending their territory from those who would do them harm. She remembered that once a human had become pack, in the galactic records Catherine 4 would eventually be reclassified, and the red warning would be removed, and in its place a single notation would appear: human Vethrak, cooperative territory, and approach. With respect, ambassadors would come in the years that followed, and scientists and diplomats and curious travelers who wanted to see the impossible for themselves. They would find a world that was still dangerous and still wild and still full of apex predators that could kill them in 100 different ways. But they would also find something else. They would find Vethrax who tolerated human presence and who traded with human settlements and who sometimes chose human companions the way Socketh's cubs had chosen Mira. They would find proof that the galaxy was stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. And if they asked the Vethrax how this had happened, and if the translators could convey the question, and if the predators chose to answer, then the answer was always the same. A human came to us broken and weak and dying, and we chose to keep her warm. She chose to stay and to learn and to become one of us. She chose to fight for us and kill for us and weed us. And we chose her in return. That is what pack means. That is what humans do. They find us in the dark and they stay, and they become ours and we become theirs. And that made all the difference. Myra Vasquez would return to Catherine 4 many times in the years that followed, and each time Socketh would meet her at the landing site and press her great head against the human's chest and make the sound that meant welcome home. And Myra would stand among the predators who had saved her life, and she would remember the fever dreams and the warmth and the moment when 6 cubs had decided that one small soft creature was worth protecting. She had crashed on a death world with nothing but a broken arm and a fading hope. She had woken in a nest surrounded by apex predators, and she had risen to build a throne that was the human way. That was the only way she knew, and the galaxy was learning to respect it.